presentation, I guess, more so than a workshop on interview preparation, but the format that I'll use is 30 minutes approximately presentation, and then leave plenty of time for questions or comments or any feedback. In fact, oftentimes one of the great things about doing interactive sessions like this is that you get insight from other people that are in attendance as well. So it's very useful to have that discussion at the end. And I think there can be a lot of learning from that. But in terms of what we are going to cover now in the next 30 minutes or so, it is going to be looking at types of interviews. So I'll give you a brief overview of different possible types of interviews that you may encounter, how to prepare in advance, regardless of what type of interview you would be attending, the importance of first impressions and the impression, I suppose, that you create either in person or online when attending for interview. The Specifically, I'm going to focus a little bit on video interviews because obviously they're very prevalent now. And many of you, if you are being called for interview, will either have a synchronous, which is like a live interview. So that'd be like the likes of Zoom or Skype, or an asynchronous, which would be like kind of a pre-recorded interview. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well, just to give you a sense of what maybe you could expect around video interviews. And oftentimes, I suppose the main kind of focus of interview preparation is around competency-based interviews. So a competency-based interview can be conducted as part of a video interview. So we'll look at like kind of the types of questions that you might get asked, and then all importantly, a very good, effective technique that you can use for answering competency-based questions called the STAR technique. Some of you may have come across it before, but it's quite simple, and if you plan in advance, it can be very useful in terms of preparing yourself for interview. So that's what we're going to cover today. Just making sure if anyone has any problem and they're not seeing the slides or the list of things, you might just pop a question in the chat box or raise your hand if you want me to check it out. But I'm just assuming that the slides are moving ahead. We're on slide 3 of 20. Now moving on to slide 4. Yeah, everyone's okay with seeing slides? Sounds good. Okay, so just the overview on types of interviews. So oftentimes a phone interview, so you can see the list of them here. So you've got phone interview, traditional format, video, group interview, panel interviews, lunch and dinner. Is that an interview? I would say absolutely yes, it is, and we'll have a chat about that in a second. Informational interviews, strengths-based interviews, and competency-based interviews. So as I said, really we're predominantly going to be focusing on kind of the competency interview question structure today, but it's no harm to kind of give you a sense and an overview of other options. So oftentimes in the past, in particular, a phone interview would be used as an initial type screening interview. So the candidate will have submitted the CV or application, and the phone interview was often the first stage. Now, obviously, in the COVID-19 world that we're living in, many companies may use phone interviews as their in-depth interview to determine whether or not they want to hire a candidate. What I would say as, I suppose, a tip around phone interviews is, even if you are doing a phone interview, obviously you're not going to be seen, but it's probably no harm to kind of get into the mode of like kind of thinking that you're going for interview. So nearly getting dressed formally, like as if you're going for interview, because even behaviorally, it'll get you into that mindset. And if you do have, because again, the benefit of a phone interview is you can have all your material and all your preparation laid out in front of you. Make sure that you're not like kind of, scrunching through paper like that when you're on a phone interview. So you want to make sure that you have all of the material set out. But really, a lot of the other rules then that we're going to talk about in terms of interview preparation will apply regardless of whether it's face-to-face video or phone interview. So a traditional interview is, like the icon there, it's kind of that face-to-face. It will, all interviews will comprise some what we'll call traditional questions. So, tell me a little bit about yourself. Why are you applying for this job? Why do you think you're the right person for this job? So those types of like kind of traditional questions will definitely be asked at nearly all interviews. But I suppose in terms of the move away from traditional interviews, oftentimes that is because you know, companies for legislative purposes, but also for comparative purposes, it makes sense for a company to be able to compare candidates with each other. And so asking similar based behavior questions are a good way of like assessing that. So you have maybe some traditional questions, but coupled with, you know, most likely the competency based structure, and we'll see that in a moment as well. I mentioned video, that we're going to look a little bit more specifically at that today, because what you will find now is that you'll either have, you know, most likely if you're being interviewed, it'll be a live video interview, or it'll allow you to record yourself and then that will be submitted for a role that you're applying for. So other types of interviews then are a group-based interview, and you'll find that particularly as part of a process. Oftentimes you may be called to an assessment center, and within an assessment center, as part of the recruitment, the company will engage in a number of different activities. So one could be, you know, a group interview. It could be a group discussion-based scenario. It could be one-on-one interviews, presentations, etc. A panel interview then is where you have a panel of, I suppose I should have turned that icon upside down really, because rather than it being one person interviewing two, it's the opposite. So you'd have like kind of, you know, two or more. You could have up to, I mean, in some instances in the public sector, you can have panels of like 5 people interviewing one candidate. So I suppose the thing there is that you need to kind of bear in mind is how you are managing to engage with all of the members on the panel, and not just, you know, one person on the panel throughout the focus of the interview. Then sometimes candidates will be invited over the course of a day to, you know, engage in, maybe they might have to deliver a presentation, then go for an interview, and then they may be invited to lunch or dinner as part of that whole process. So would say to you that, like, consider that while lunch and dinner may be informal and chat like, it is still part of the whole recruitment process if a company is engaging in that. So expect that you are still being, you know, reviewed, and you are still like kind of in performance mode in terms of ensuring that you are demonstrating that you have the skills and experience and competencies that are required for the role. So the bottom 3 then are informational interviews. So oftentimes an informational interview is where you are trying to essentially get some information on a role or on a company. And actually, this would be the kind of thing that I would say you would use LinkedIn for in particular. So you'd use an informational type structure. So it might be a little bit about, so tell me about a day in the life of, you know, you're working in this organization, or, you know, tell me about your career path. How did you get into a career in this organization and what was involved? And would you have any suggestions for me? I'm interested in this area. So it's really, from your perspective, it's gathering information about roles that you might be interested in going forward. So then the next and final 2 are strengths and competency. So these often relate to more the type of question that you're asked rather than the format of the interview. So the others are more around format. These are questions. So strengths-based questions, essentially from a company's perspective, they know from the material that you have submitted, your application or CV, that you can do the job, that you have the educational attainment, you have the skills, the expertise that they want. What they want to know is, you know, how energized you would be by being engaged in that role. So they want to know what is important to you and what energizes you as a person. So it is as much about what you are interested in and what energizes you as it is about what you're able to do. So it's a combination of those. And you'll find that a lot of companies are starting to use some strengths-based recruitment models now. Now, if you are interested in a more in-depth look in that, you can go onto our YouTube channel where we have some videos from live sessions like this that are recorded on the strengths-based interview, the strengths-based recruitment model, and the types of questions. And then finally, and I suppose the bit that I have the magnifying glass, you know, focusing on are around the competency questions. So that's very much like around assessing your behavior. The whole idea is that a company determines. Everyone okay there? Someone just has their microphone on. Might just turn off the microphone if you don't mind.
Let's hope it's off.
so basically, yeah, essentially the company has a list of competencies or attributes or skills that they're looking for from the candidate, and they're going to ask you, can you tell the stories of times that you demonstrated those competencies? So, very simple example is, every company will want someone who's good at communicating, and can you talk about a time that demonstrated excellent communication? I'm just going to, if you bear with me for a moment, I'm just going to mute everyone, just because I think someone's having difficulty um, with maybe their microphone, and I will turn that off then at the end in case anyone wants to ask questions. Okay, so they're the types of interviews, both, as I said, the format and the content, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail now on those. But before you think about, I suppose, how you answer questions within an interview scenario, it is worth kind of taking a bit of a bird's eye view and thinking about what is it that an employer wants to know. Broadly speaking, there are three big questions that an employer wants answered. You've demonstrated the first if you've gotten called to interview. Can you do the job? So you have shown that on paper, according to the criteria that are set by the company, you can do the job. And that's why they've called you to interview. So that's great. You get a tick for that very first one in terms of an interview. Really, the next two questions, and that's why they're calling you to interview. They want to know, will you do the job? So are you motivated, enthusiastic enough, knowledgeable enough? Have you got the kind of the attributes, the interpersonal, the communication, the abilities, as well as the technical expertise to do the job? So will you do the job? And then thirdly, will you fit in? So will you fit in? And that means to the culture of the company, the way the company operates, the mindset of the company, the vision of the company. How does that align with like kind of what's important to you and where you see yourself going? So really, those are the three kind of, I suppose, if you think of the high level questions that an employer wants answered in relation to an interview, it is, can you do the job? Will you do the job? And will you fit into the culture of the organization? The other thing that's, I suppose, important before we look at the types of questions that you might answer is all of the work that you need to kind of engage in before the interview itself. So, aside from preparing your own competencies and your own questions, there's a number of things that you need to consider. So, first of all, looking at like the job description, the job spec, and in the majority of cases, and particularly when companies are using competency-based structures, they have given you a list on the job description of the essential and desirable criteria for the job. And what we would recommend, and I would recommend to you, is that you literally get your page with all of those essential and desirable criteria and start to think about how you meet all of the criteria that the organization is looking for. Because when it comes to even before the interview, in terms of before you get called for an interview, that's the information that the company will use to determine who gets screened and who gets called to interview. So they will look for you to meet those desirable and essential criteria. Well, essential first, obviously, and then desirable criteria. The other thing that's really important is to do your homework on the company. So a lot of people will attend for interview and they'll have done all the self-reflection and the introspection of themselves and know what their skills and abilities and competencies are, and that's all very important. But you also need to put in the work into knowing what the company or the role and the organization or the department within the organization that you're aiming for. So things like, how long has the company been established, or the service department you're applying for? What about like a little bit around facts and figures now? So it's not necessarily that you need to know, the company was established in such and such a year and it has this many employees. It's more in depth than that. I mean, you can get that from any website in the about section, and so obviously you do need to know that. But if a company says, so what research have you done, or what do you know about us and our role, it is that you have thought through in terms of the services provided, how you relate to those services. So where you would see yourself fitting into the organization. That you've used, say, for example, LinkedIn to see if there's anyone in your network through maybe the UL alumni that works in the organization, and you've reached out and found out like what their role is and how they're engaged. Or things like, major achievements. So are you following the company on LinkedIn, or maybe are you following them on Twitter and keeping abreast of trends that are happening within the organization? So it would be very important to, as I said, do your homework on the company before you go for interview as well. Preparing a list of questions that you could be asked, obviously, but also maybe questions that you might ask at the end of the interview. When you are, oftentimes asked that, is there anything that you'd like to add or that you'd like to ask in relation to the organization? And then obviously, this depends on whether you are going for a face-to-face interview or not, but planning the logistics, like for example, your outfit, like how long it's going to get, to take you to get to the destination. I mean, I think UL, and you're all familiar with UL. I think UL is a good example of, if you were called for an interview to UL and you'd never been there before, like trying to find parking in UL can be very difficult at the best of times. So giving yourself plenty of time to get to your destination, to know where it is, because like that, if you arrived to UL and you came by bus even, and you arrive outside, the stables courtyard, and your interview is over in the clinical sciences building, you've got a fairly long trek to kind of go across the other side of campus. So make sure that you have like kind of done all of that planning well in advance of attending your interview. Obviously, even when it comes to a video interview, there are logistics around making sure that you have your camera set up, you've tested the audio, you've tested the video, that you've got like good lighting so that your lighting is coming from in front of you and not behind you for the interview. You don't want to be too washed out. So all of those things, it's a good idea to practice in advance of the interview. And then practice, 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 practice. So if it is a video interview, practice recording yourself, review what you've review the answers that you've given to the questions. Or if it is a live interview and you want to do some live practice, log on to Careers Connect and make an appointment with myself or one of the team to engage in a mock interview. And that way, you going through like kind of the practice of the types of questions and the types of answers that you will prepare for. Okay, so moving on, first impressions I mentioned are very important, and they are. And I mean, there's a research out there to show the impact that first impressions make. Now, I don't want to scare you off with this either when I show you, some of the statistics around first impressions, because part of the reason that competency interviews and behavioral based interviews were introduced was to override the first impressions that people can make. So, for example, and in a good way. So, for example, there is research out there that says that first impressions are formed within 7 to 17 seconds of meeting someone. So, I mean, you literally, just log on or you meet someone and you shake hands with them and you have formed that first impression. And that similar research of about 2,000 managers claimed that 33% knew whether or not they would hire someone within 90 seconds. So within a minute and a half, they've made a decision as to whether they're going to hire someone or not. Now, there's a lot around bias and unconscious bias that will impact that, and that is part of the reason that the competency based structure is very fair in terms of like dealing with candidates, because candidates have the chance to tell their story about how they manage to engage with or deal with different types of competencies, rather than just making a very good first impression and that being the reason they're hired, rather than on the basis of their skill and their ability. Um, and then one of the things I suppose that is important in terms of any interview you go to, there's going to be lots of nonverbal information that you're going to give out and receive. And one of the biggest nonverbal mistakes that a candidate can make is failing to make eye contact with whomever is interviewing them or the panel of interviewers. So again, that's something to think about how you're going to manage in terms of maintaining eye contact and practicing. Because sometimes, again, if you're not comfortable with that, it is around just getting into the habit of practicing that with someone. So if we are looking then at video interviews, and I suppose there is, it is a little bit harder in terms of, for example, the nonverbals like eye contact in videos, but still it is important to address these factors and think about how you can address these factors. So as I mentioned, Well, first of all, sorry, before I tell you about the synchronous and asynchronous. So, why do employers use video interviews? So, for them, it shortens the time to hire because, particularly if they're recorded, you can do it in your own time. Not an employer doesn't need to be there live having an interview with you, and they can review in their time as well. It's less expensive for them in that regard because, okay, they have to, pay for whatever platform they're using, but a lot of like kind of the work that's done is that back end IT based work, and then they're receiving all of the videos of the candidates. It's flexible for both. So I mean, you can decide, on a Saturday night at 9 o'clock that you want to complete your interview rather than the predetermined time being decided by the employer and you being invited. Does it lead to happier candidates in that basis? I mean, given that flexibility, I suppose employers would say yes, and therefore, that it's a better return from the employer's perspective if you've got happier candidates applying to them and succeeding, and fair outcomes and reduced bias. And I suppose this comes back to the first impressions and the unconscious bias that I was talking about. When you are being videoed, it is the first impression that you're making is on the video is going to be very similar to everyone else. You don't have that same level of interaction, so everyone is on the same playing field, this level playing field in relation to the fair outcomes. So how it works. So I guess the first thing to say is, like, kind of as I mentioned, I mean, okay, so the likes of Skype and Zoom would be like a live interview. So we wouldn't consider those video interviews per se, in the same way, a recorded video interview is very much like kind of, you are recording and submitting a video of yourself. So Skype and Zoom will allow you to engage interactively with the recruiter and with the interviewer. Um, but these one-way or on-demand type video interviews are being used by 40% of graduate recruiters. So they're the ones where you record. So you'll receive an email from the employer, you'll have a link with that email, and you'll have up to about 72 hours to complete the interview. So oftentimes they will send it on a Thursday afternoon, and that does give you then the weekend. That's what tends to happen with a lot of the graduate recruiters. Generally speaking, you'll have up to about 6 questions. For each question, there's a minute reading time, which isn't recorded, so the chance for you to read whatever the question is on screen, and then 2 minutes answering time, which is recorded. You don't generally have the opportunity to retake. However, you do have the opportunity to complete some practice questions, and they're not seen by the employer. So definitely it is worth completing that, but even in advance of that, to do some practicing just so that you get used to the whole process of recording yourself would definitely be advisable. So organizations that use video interviews are the list there that I have put up. So right the way across between like large corporations in all sectors that are very much engaging in those video recording based interview options. And you'll be able to review that afterwards once we put the slides up on the YouTube channel. But I suppose just importantly to tell you in terms of tips for success. So I've said this a couple of times, try and simulate the conditions, get used to what it'll be like, get your laptop or your tablet out and practice recording yourself, or even if it's, on your phone that you're practicing recording yourself, and record yourself under the timed conditions. So remember, you have approximately 2 minutes to answer those questions. So if you start to record yourself in 2 minutes, what are you saying in the 2 minutes that you have for each, competency area? As I mentioned, I suppose in terms of like kind of the types of questions that you'll get asked. So you'll have those traditional questions like the tell me about yourself. They will work through competency questions, and we're going to look at those in a second. So even though it's a video format, it's still a competency interview. They may ask you about your knowledge of the company and technical questions around your expertise for the role. And they might ask you what you'd like to add. So think about like kind of, how you might address each of those different aspects in an interview. this might be something that you'd see. So this is the higher view example. So, they'll have the question there, why would you be suitable for the role? And then you will see your picture in the recording, and then it'll tell you, the time that you have to answer, and you will have the opportunity to stop recording once you have completed the answer. So a couple of tips for you on this. Look at the camera and not your photo, is a good idea. So even to put a post-it note over your photo, if that's going to stop you looking at that, or put a post-it note behind the camera on your laptop or your recording device. And so that you're looking at that, you're making like kind of eye contact in as much as possible with whomever is going to be reviewing the questions. Do the practice questions. Test, as I said, your camera lighting and sound. So you don't want to be like kind of too washed out, or in too dark of a background. Finish within time, and then use the star structure and smile, because actually it's interesting that there are algorithms that are being used in terms of preparing these, and so facial expressions like kind of are being monitored. So definitely like kind of engage and smile as you would if you were like kind of in a face-to-face interview. So the star technique that I talked about. So the STAR technique is really, really useful to answer questions that are competency based. So competency based questions are often called structured or behavioral questions or behavioral interviews, and really I think the best way to liken them is that it's like a story. So describe a situation where you had to, and you see the list here, show leadership, make a difficult decision, work as a team. But essentially, it's like, tell me a story about a time that you were a good leader, or tell me a story about a time that you showed like great teamwork. Or tell me a story about a time that you worked in a team and someone wasn't pulling their weight. How did you deal with it? So again, it's kind of like taking it on a continuum. If you take, your best case scenario, so tell me about a time that you were excellent at being able to work as part of a team. Or tell me about a time that it was difficult to work as part of a team or you had to work with a difficult colleague. So you're trying to kind of think about both sides of the spectrum or the continuum, if you will. And in terms of like kind of answering, it's good to think of a structure that like allows you to tell that story. And so this is a good structure to use, the STAR structure. So it's S for describing the situation, T for the task you were faced with, A for the action that you took, or for the result that you achieved, or an additional or for the reflection of what you learned. So if we look at that, for example, and we're talking about, tell me a time that you worked in a team and that you worked really, really well as part of a team. You might be talking about a particular time when maybe you were on your co-op work experience, or when you were in class involved in a module and you had to work as a part of a team of 4 to engage in a project. So you'd briefly give like kind of an overview. You don't want to go into too much detail painting that picture. So that's kind of the background story of like kind of the situation in terms of your story. The task that you were faced with even. So what was your objective? What did you have to do, with whom, where, by when? So that's your task. Now, the meat of, or I should say the meat for any vegetarians in the audience, but the core part of the STAR answer is A and R, is the action and the result. And what's really important here is, particularly if you get asked a question like something around working as part of a team, don't use an answer like, well, we did this and then we did that and we did the other. You want it to be about you. You're the only one that's in the interview. So make sure when you are talking that you are saying, well, in my role and my part of the role in the team was I did this. And while the objective for us all was to do this, my engagement was as follows. And so you're very much talking about your specific role within the team. And as I mentioned, the results. So I mean, in some instances, the results can be, metric or measured. So if you got a great grade, in that team-based activity, well, then that can be like kind of a very good example of a result. But it's not always as easy to have something that's like kind of measured or a metric that you can use. So it might be around what you've learned or what you've learned to do better, and particularly if you've come up against an obstacle in some of those instances. So that reflection can be very, very good. And it shows that you've thought through and that you've learned from an activity you're engaged in, and that you would do something differently the next time. So the benefit of the STAR technique is that it gives you a structure that you can use to answer a host of those competency questions. So I listed some of them there earlier, but if you were to drill them into questions, it might be something like this. Tell me about a time you had to cope with a strict deadline, or work pressure. What happened? How did you do it? What was involved in that? So oftentimes, actually, if you give too high level an answer, or you don't go into detail enough, a good recruiter will actually ask you questions that like follow the STAR. So you might have kind of gone into description of the situation and the task, and you mightn't have like told enough about the action. So they might say, well, what did you do and how did you do that? And what was the objective and why did that not work? So they'll dig in a little bit more to try and get the full star story from you. But you should always try and prepare so that you cover STA, or because some recruiters may not. And I suppose the other thing to remember is that not everyone who will interview you is trained to interview you. So you want to try and get across as much information as you can that's relevant to the role as possible. So you can see there that there's like different examples of questions that you might get asked around competency, but it's very much tell me about a time or describe a time, or can you describe a situation when. So it is, I liken it all the time to like telling a story. If you can think in terms of telling a story about your past experience. So, as a quick recap, I think there's a couple of things that are important around preparing for interview. Advanced preparation is very important. So, whether that's preparation, looking at the job description, looking at the company, looking at the logistics around the planning, so all of that advanced preparation is very important. Put yourself in the shoes of the recruiter. So, what we mean by that is that you think what they're looking for. So they've told you on paper what they want, but through your research you've seen what the company is like, what their structure is, what their vision, what their values are, and try and like kind of put yourself in their shoes in terms of what they want from a candidate in the role. Make sure you do your research of the company and the job in depth. Use resources like LinkedIn for that. Engaging with other past graduates of UL, the likes of, as I said, Twitter, as well as obviously the company website. Don't forget the power of first impressions. So it's not, I suppose, it isn't the be all, but first impressions do count. So you want to try and make as good a first impression as you can. And so that very much includes the nonverbal, in terms of your presentation, your eye contact, the tone of voice. And so keep an eye on that. And that's like kind of, again, that's another good reason to practice. um, Particularly around video interviews at the moment, to record and review yourself. So record and time yourself and the 90-second or the 2-minute answer, and then review and see what that sounds like. Are you using, can you, when you tell the story, are you using the star structure in terms of your answers? And so that competency based questions, that they pretty much prevail through an awful lot of the interview based questions that are asked. And can you look and see what are your competencies. And even if you're preparing competency based questions, maybe try and think of preparing them across 3 different arenas. So you might say, communication. Can I think of an example of when I demonstrated good communication through college, through modules and work that I've been involved in, with others in college? So that's one arena. Second might be through work experience. So can I think of a time that I engaged in good communication through my part-time job or through work that I've done in the past? So that's 2. 3 might be in your extracurricular. So are you involved in clubs or societies or volunteering activities? And can you think then of an example of when you demonstrated communication in that realm or in that arena? So you're coming up with 3 examples across like kind of, your whole life, if you will, whether that is education, experience, or extracurricular. And then you can draw on all of those when you're in an interview scenario. And using that STAR technique is it's a simple tool, but you do have to work at it, because what you want to make sure that you do is focus on pretty much the action and the result and the reflection as the three very strong and important components to it. Yes, you need to have a good, S situation and T task, but that's setting the scene so the rest of your answer makes sense.